When Tamar Braxton's voice broke and she uttered words that followers had never heard, the internet froze. Not about fame, not about music, but about what it cost her to grow up inside her own family. What began as a contemplative moment quickly evolved into a cultural shockwave since Tamar had stopped making hits. She claims that for decades, people followed her as she spoke candidly about suffering, and the name at the center of it all wasn't a producer, an ex, or the industry. It was her mother. Fans weren't ready. The timeline was not prepared. Furthermore, the legacy of Braxton was undoubtedly unprepared. According to Tamar, what she endured wasn't a single argument or a rough patch. It was a long-standing pattern that shaped her relationships, her self-esteem, and how she learned to live in a household where pressure and love were intertwined. She didn't accuse, she didn't dramatize, she described, and that's what made it hit harder. Clips appeared everywhere in a matter of minutes. A fresh perspective was applied to old episodes. Comments flooded in from viewers saying, "Wait, we saw this and didn't realize what it meant." Fans started connecting dots they hadn't connected before, realizing that moments once dismissed as tough love might have landed very differently for the child on the receiving end. Evelyn Braxton's name trended not with anger at first, but with disbelief. Was this really how Tamar experienced her childhood? Did the family dynamic everyone celebrated come with a hidden cost? And why was Tamar choosing now to finally say it out loud? What shocked fans most wasn't just what Tamar revealed. It was the way she sounded at ease doing it. No yelling, no theatrics, just the kind of truth that sounds heavy because it's been carried too long. And once that door opened, the internet realized something chilling. This was not a historical revelation. It was a reckoning with everything fans thought they understood. And the story was only just beginning. The shift didn't happen with a scream or a meltdown. It happened quietly. And that's what rattled people. Tamar Braxton didn't come forward-waving allegations or requests for an apology. She spoke in a manner typical of people who have run out of energy to defend a narrative that was never truly theirs in the first place. Cool, collected, and truthful in a manner that sounded like something she had practiced for years, but never thought she'd actually speak out loud. When Tamar began talking about her upbringing, fans expected the familiar narrative: tough love, strict parenting, and high standards in a musical home. That story has been told before, but this time Tamar didn't stop there. It was patterns, not moments, that she discussed. She talked about how certain behaviors repeated for decades, shaping how she saw herself long before cameras ever entered their lives. And she made it clear that what she experienced felt less like guidance and more like pressure that never let up. She didn't say her mother was evil. She didn't say she was unloved. What she said was far more unsettling. She stated the environment taught her to shrink, to doubt her instincts, to feel like approval was conditional and constantly at risk. And that changed everything for viewers who had been watching the family for years. Suddenly, old scenes felt different. Moments where Evelyn Braxton corrected Tamar on camera were no longer just discipline. They looked like public undermining. Jokes that once felt harmless now carried an edge. Tamar's feelings, which have long been condemned as too much, started to look like the natural response of someone who had been holding things in for too long. As clips resurfaced, the internet began doing what it always does. When a familiar story cracks open, it rewatched everything. Fans noticed how often Tamar's feelings were dismissed, how quickly conversations turned into lectures, how praise was sometimes followed by comparison. None of this proved intent, but it painted a picture of a dynamic where love and control were tangled in ways, Tamar says, left scars that didn't fade with age. What made this moment explode wasn't just what Tamar said, it was how long she waited to say it. She talked about carrying this quietly for decades, about choosing silence to preserve family peace. The world had already determined that her mother was the family's pillar of support, the hero, and the reason they were successful, so she felt bad for even questioning the dynamic. Speaking up meant taking a chance on that reputation and running the risk of being called unappreciative. Fans sensed the tension right away. Some jumped to Evelyn's defense, claiming that having 5 kids in the spotlight couldn't have been simple and that parenting isn't faultless. Others said intent matters less than impact, that a child's experience is valid, even if the parent meant well. The comment section split sharply, but one thing was consistent. People were listening differently now. Tamar also addressed why she stayed quiet for so long. She discussed how celebrity makes recovery more difficult. How, once your family establishes a reputation, informing the truth feels like sabotage. How cameras reward conflict but punish vulnerability. And how for years she believed swallowing her pain was the price of belonging, not just to her family, but to the story the world loved. That admission hit hard because it suggested Tamar wasn't just fighting personal injuries. She was battling a story that was larger than herself, one that cast her as the difficult one, the emotional one, the problem child. And hearing her explain how that label formed at home before it followed her into adulthood made fans rethink everything they thought they knew. Old criticism came under fire. Why was Tamar always expected to apologize? Why were her boundaries labeled disrespect? Why was her honesty treated as instability? Her previous outbursts started to appear through this lens as stored pain, finally coming to the surface rather than haphazard chaos. Evelyn's role in this story remained complex. Tamar didn't paint her as a villain. She painted her as a powerful presence whose remarks were powerful, weight that sometimes crushed rather than supported. That nuance made the revelation harder to dismiss. It wasn't an assault, it was an explanation. And because they encourage empathy, explanations are risky. Fans who grew up in similar households spoke up, saying, Tamar's words mirrored their own experiences with parents who loved deeply but led harshly. Others pushed back, warning against rewriting history through adult pain. The debate wasn't about facts anymore. It was about interpretation of impact. Tamar's tone was the most noticeable thing. It contained neither retaliation nor a call for public responsibility, just tiredness. The kind that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long and finally deciding it's okay to put it down, even if people don't like how it looks. One thing was evident at the conclusion of this initial wave. This wasn't a family spat. It was a reframing of a legacy. Tamar hadn't just told it like it was. She had made fans reevaluate the Braxton narrative they had long accepted, and that left everyone asking the same uneasy question. If this is how Tamar experienced her upbringing, what else have we misunderstood all along? Because once a story this familiar starts to crack, it rarely stops with just one revelation. The second wave didn't originate from Tamar speaking further. It came from people hearing her differently. Once the first shock wore off, the conversation shifted from disbelief to examination. And that's when the story became heavier. Fans were no longer responding to a headline. They were reprocessing years of footage, interviews, and moments they'd once brushed off as just family dynamics. What stood out immediately was how Tamar described longevity. This wasn't about one argument or a single harsh moment. She spoke about repetition, patterns, cycles that reset, not resolve. And for many listeners, that distinction flipped a switch. You can forgive one bad day. The same emotional strain over decades lands differently. Viewers went back to the earliest seasons and noticed something unnerving. Tamar often entered conversations already defensive, already bracing. Before being charged, she would defend herself. Before being confronted, she would apologize. That posture, once criticized as dramatic, now looked like conditioning. Like someone who learned early that peace required preemptive surrender. The language Tamar used mattered. She described feeling controlled rather than understood, about being corrected publicly and comforted privately, if at all, about love that came with expectations so high they left no room for rest. None of that accused Evelyn of malice. It did, however, imply a household in which gaining and losing approval was something you had to work for. The argument became more intense at that point. Some fans insisted this was just old-school parenting, that many black households relied on toughness to prepare children for a hard world. They argued that without Evelyn's discipline, there would be no Braxton suck story. Others countered that survival skills can coexist with emotional harm and that outcomes don't erase impact. Tamar's words pulled that tension into the open. She spoke about how being the youngest didn't protect her. It amplified scrutiny, about how comparisons between sisters, even when unspoken, hung in the air, about how being gifted didn't always equate to being taken seriously. For fans who had watched her be labeled the difficult one for years, this seemed to be the late arrival of context. Then an unforeseen event occurred. People started apologizing, not publicly to Tamar, but in comment sections to each other. Not publicly to Tamar, but in comment sections to each other. Viewers acknowledged that they had misinterpreted her suffering for personality, laughed at times that now felt awkward, and judged her too harshly. Those admissions didn't dominate the timeline, but they mattered. They signaled a shift from spectacle to reflection. Evelyn's silence during this phase was read carefully. Some interpreted it as respect, allowing Tamar space to speak without interruption. Others perceived it as avoidance, but the lack of a rebuttal changed the tone. Tamar's story stood alone in the absence of a counterargument, not challenged, not confirmed, just present. Additionally, presence carries weight. Beyond the Braxtons, the conversation expanded. Mental health advocates chimed in about how family dynamics shape adult behavior, about how children raised in high-pressure environments often struggle with boundaries later, about how emotional invalidation doesn't require cruelty to be damaging. Tamar's story became a case study, not in blame, but in consequence. What complicated things further was Tamar's acknowledgement of love. She didn't deny being cared for. She didn't deny sacrifice. She refused to categorize the relationship as either positive or negative, discussing both thankfulness and suffering in one sentence. Some viewers who were hoping for a villain were disappointed by that refusal, but others who were in the gray area of loving someone who hurt them. Fans noticed how careful Tamar was with her words. She expressed her feelings in her speech. She framed experiences, not verdicts. That restraint made the revelations harder to dismiss as bitterness. It sounded like someone who had already done the internal work and was now sharing, not exploding. The backlash decreased, but did not go away as this phase progressed. As this phase unfolded, the backlash softened but did not vanish. Some accused Tamar of rewriting history. Others warned against diagnosing family members from a distance, but even critics acknowledged something had shifted. The narrative that Tamar was simply too emotional no longer held as is. There was context now, and context demands reconsideration. Old interviews resurfaced where Tamar talked about anxiety, self-doubt, and feeling misunderstood. In light of her recent comments, those moments felt less random. They looked connected, like symptoms of something long-standing, rather than isolated struggles. And then there was the question of timing. Why now? Tamara addressed it without drama. She talked about age, about therapy, about reaching a point where protecting a family image mattered less than protecting her peace. She framed the revelation not as an attack, but as a boundary, one she wished she'd learned sooner. That framing changed the stakes. This wasn't about exposing someone else. It was about freeing herself. Additionally, viewers found it more difficult to discount the story as opportunistic because of that intention. It didn't feel strategic. It felt overdue. By the end of this second phase, the story had outgrown shock. It became about recognition, recognizing how easily audiences flatten complex family relationships into archetypes, recognizing how often emotional expression is punished when it makes others uncomfortable, recognizing how narratives stick even when they're incomplete. Tamar hadn't asked fans to choose sides, but she had asked them implicitly to look again. And the third stage is unavoidable once people resume their search. Because re-examination doesn't stop at empathy. It leads to reckoning with what we believed, what we excused, and what we missed when the cameras were rolling. The question looming now wasn't whether Tamar was telling the truth, that it was what that truth means for a family whose story has been told, retold, and celebrated for years, and whether there's room in that legacy for a version that's more complicated, more uncomfortable, and more human than fans ever expected. By the time the third phase took hold, the conversation had shifted from shock and empathy into something far more unsettling. Redefined Tamar Braxton's words weren't just being heard anymore. The Braxton family story was being deliberately rewritten, and once a legacy starts being reinterpreted, there's no clean way to put it back the way it was. At this stage, fans weren't asking whether Tamar's feelings were valid. That question had largely settled. Instead, they were asking what her truth meant for everything they had consumed for decades. The dinners, the arguments, the reconciliations, the moments once framed as tough love or harmless shade now sat under a harsher light. Not because Tamar demanded it, but because her perspective made it impossible to unsee. What became clear was how normalized certain dynamics had been. Viewers noticed how often Tamar was expected to bend first, how frequently her reactions were labeled too much, while similar behavior from others was excused as stress or passion, how the flow of apologies led to peace rather than resolution. Tamar's revelation didn't invent these patterns, it highlighted them, and that distinction mattered. The conversation about Evelyn Braxton grew more layered, not more hostile. Rather than turning her into a villain, many fans began talking about generational cycles, about how strength, when forged through hardship, can harden into rigidity, about how parents can give everything they have and still pass down wounds they never had the tools to heal. Evelyn wasn't being reduced to a single role. She was being examined as a human, shaped by her own history. That complexity unsettled people who wanted clarity. Some fans demanded accountability. Others insisted on grace. Most hovered uncomfortably in between. Tamar's refusal to simplify her story forced the audience to sit in that discomfort. She didn't offer a neat ending. She didn't demand an apology tour. She simply told the truth, as she experienced it, and left the interpretation with the listener. At that point, the reckoning became more intense. Mental health experts commented that children from high-achieving families frequently internalized the idea that love must be earned. Fans connected Tamar's words to her well-documented struggles with anxiety, self-worth, and emotional regulation. The pieces aligned in ways that felt clarifying and painful. Old labels began to fall apart. Difficult became unheard. Dramatic became overloaded. Disrespectful became protective. Not everyone agreed with this reframing, but few could ignore it. Evelyn's continued silence during this phase took on a different tone. It no longer felt like avoidance to many viewers. It felt like gravity, like someone absorbing the weight of what had been said and choosing not to rush into correction or control. Others continued to want recognition, conversation, and resolution, but the absence of a response kept the focus on Tamar's experience, not a debate about who was right. The family brand, once so cohesive, now looked more fragile. Fans wondered how future appearances would feel, whether conversations could return to surface-level harmony, whether unresolved truths would sit between them, unspoken but present. the notion that suffering and love could coexist. So visibly challenged, the polished narrative reality TV often relies on. What made this phase especially sobering was the realization that nothing explosive had happened. No scandal, no screaming match, no dramatic reveal, just one woman telling her truth after years of carrying it quietly. However, that was sufficient to undermine a narrative that millions of people believed to be true. Some viewers accused Tamar of rehashing old wounds. Others thanked her for naming experiences they'd never had language for. The divide wasn't about facts. It was about readiness. Not everyone is prepared to look back at the past from a different perspective, particularly when that past felt reassuring in its own right. Tamar addressed that indirectly. She spoke about how healing isn't about rewriting history to punish others. It's about reclaiming your own narrative so it stops controlling you. She framed her honesty as an act of self-respect, not retaliation. That framing stripped the moment of spectacle and left only meaning. By now, the conversation had slowed, not because it lost relevance, but because it grew heavier. People sat with it. They reflected. They contrasted the dynamics of their own families. They reconsidered moments they'd laughed at or dismissed. This was no longer a viral outcry. It was quiet reckoning. The lasting impact wasn't a verdict on Evelyn Braxton as a mother. It was a challenge to the audience to recognize that public stories are incomplete, that family legacies can hold both love and harm, and that listening doesn't require choosing sides. This chapter doesn't end with resolution. No rebuttal, no apology, no well-tied bow. And maybe that's the point. Real healing rarely comes with credits rolling or theme music swelling. Sometimes it comes with truth finally spoken and the courage to let it stand unanswered. Tamar Braxton did not reveal a villain. She exposed a reality many people recognize but rarely name. That growing up loved does not imply a childhood free of scars. Furthermore, paying tribute to your parents does not make your suffering go away. And once that truth is spoken out loud, it can't be unheard by the family, by the fans, or by anyone who's ever wondered why something that looked like love still hurt for so long. Take a moment to consider this before scrolling, because it wasn't a takedown or gossip. It was a reminder of how easily we flatten real people into characters, and how long pain can hide behind a smile, a brand, or a legacy we think we understand. Should tomorrow's honesty made you rethink even one moment you've seen on screen, hit that like button right now. This informs the algorithm that discussions about emotional truth, healing, and accountability should have more room than just drama and indignation. Leave a remark and talk from the heart. Have you ever grown up in a family where love existed, but so did pressure that left marks no one talked about? This comment section isn't just reactions. It's where people realize they're not alone. And subscribe. Seriously, because stories like this don't end with a headline. They evolve, perspectives shift, more context comes out, and you don't want to hear the next chapter through distorted clips or bad faith takes. Remaining grounded is essential to staying subscribed. Stay with us. Stay thoughtful. And remember, telling your truth is not about destroying other people. Sometimes it's the first real step toward finally standing on your